everyone for joining us for our first in the series of our new Future of the Past webinars. My name is Beth Marsh, and I am with the Organization of American Historians. We are joined today by 4 experts on the Electoral College. And before I introduce them, I just want to take care of a few housekeeping issues. If you have questions, please drop those into the Q&A box rather than using the chat box. We will attempt to keep our eye on the chat box in case it gets there accidentally, but we can't be certain that we're not going to miss something there. If you have a question or a concern as the webinar is going on, please feel free to privately message me or Sydney, who is also listed designated as OAH staff. And so this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for viewing on the OAH website probably early next week. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 4 speakers. The first is Katerina Horska. She is the Director of Legal Affairs and Policy for the Office of the Federal Register and the National Archives and Records Administration. Ms. Horska supervises the legal staff who review documents submitted for publication in the Federal Register and codification in the Code of Federal Regulations for compliance with the requirements of applicable law. She and the legal staff are also responsible for the coordination of certain duties delegated to the OFR, including various administrative duties associated with the Electoral College process. She earned her JD from the George Washington University Law School and a BA in International Studies from the Johns Hopkins University. Our next participant is Alexander Keyssar. He is the Stirling Professor of History and Social Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is the author of Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? And The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, which received the American Historical Association's Beveridge Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. He is a co-author of Inventing in America, A History of the United States, and has written widely on public policy issues in the popular press. Max Krochmal, who is also serving as our moderator this evening, is Associate Professor of History and founding chair of the Department of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies at Texas Christian University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Blue Texas, The Making of a Multiracial Democratic Coalition in the Civil Rights Era, and co-editor of Civil Rights in Black and Brown, Histories of Resistance and Struggle in Texas, a collaborative interpretive volume which draws on over 500 new interviews with activists in every corner of the state. And finally, we have Miriam Vincent, who is the staff attorney in the Legal Affairs and Policy Division of the Office of the Federal Register at the National Archives and Record Administration. She has worked in the federal government for more than 20 years and has been involved with the Electoral College during 5 different elections in 1996, 2000, 2012, 2016, and 2020. Ms. Vincent has designed and managed the first Electoral College website that was built in 1996 and is currently working on the ongoing redesign of the Electoral College website. She has a JD from Georgetown University Law School.
All right, well, thank you, Beth. It's wonderful to be here with everybody. And thank you for everybody here in the audience. I see we already have a hand up. Just to clarify, we're not going to be able to bring any speakers onto the video today, so make sure to put your question either in the chat or using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for being here today. We're going to start with a little bit of history, and then we'll hear a little bit more about the role of NARA in preserving, collecting, disseminating records related to the Electoral College. And then we'll get into maybe some more of the present day ramifications. So we'll kick it off first with you, Alex. Again, thanks for being with us. And I think the first question, the obvious question is, why do we have an Electoral College? Why did the founders choose this particular route rather than a popular vote?
Thanks, Max, and thanks to everyone at the OAH who helped to put this program together. And I'm also delighted to meet people and to meet people from from NARA and to learn about how some of the final steps in the institution get executed. To address your question, why do we have an electoral college, or how did it come about? I think the place to start is that the framers of the Constitution, when they gathered in 1787, didn't have much of a clue about how to choose a president or a chief executive. They were stymied. The consensus view, the default view, rather, not that they used the term default view, but the default view was that Congress would choose the president. And in several straw votes over the course of the summer of 1787, that was the approach that had the most support, but it also had, there were loud objections to Congress choosing the president, basically saying that it completely undermined the separation of powers and would lead to all types of corruption. Other ideas were considered. Having a national popular vote was considered. James Madison, in fact, supported that, although he thought it would be harmful to the political interests of the slave states, including his own, because if you had a national popular vote, slaves would not be allowed to vote, and thus they would carry no weight in the selection of the president. They went around and around in the course of the summer. And then finally, at the end of the summer, and again, we can remember, this is Philadelphia, late August, no air conditioning. If any of you have ever been there, you will understand how that might encourage you to try to get things done. And the convention did something probably sensible, but a little bit unusual. Basically, everybody went on vacation, and they left it to a committee called the Committee on Unfinished Parts to deal with these knotty issues that had not yet been solved. And one of the foremost of those was how to choose a president. It was that committee that came up with the idea of an electoral college. And I think there are a couple of different ways to understand why they chose that mechanism, however complicated it may have been. One reason they went in that direction was that they did not think that Congress should choose the president. But what they created, in effect, was an institution where states wielded power directly in proportion to their congressional representation, right? Every state gets an electoral vote for every member of the House and its 2 senators. So they replicated the relative powers, and in a sense, and this was argued 30 years ago, and I think a very good article by somebody who may be online. What they did was to create the Electoral College was a version of Congress, but it served only one function, and then it disappeared. So the problems with separation of powers and corruption did not occur. Another advantage of the Electoral College and the way it was set up, or another couple of advantages from perspectives of the framers, was that it shared power between the federal government and the states in ways that we know still have significant repercussions today. And it spared them, by using this formula of the number of electors, it spared the convention the need to come up with some other formula for presidential elections about which state would get more weight. They basically just replicated what they had already decided to do with respect to Congress. So that was how the idea came about. I think it's fair to say, as my Stanford colleague has written, that it was the Electoral College was not anybody's first choice. It was something of a consensus second choice. And without getting too far ahead of the story, there were severe criticisms of it that appeared very soon, and a number of the framers of the Constitution itself demanded reforms.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, I'll stick with you for one more question. I'm really on that last point. And this is fun for me because I studied the 20th century, and I work from sort of a different frame, and it's great to get to quiz you on this. But what were some of those criticisms, and from whom did they come? And it seems to me that you said it reflected a sort of compromise in terms of federalism and who would hold power, a sort of reflection of the separation of powers in the different branches. But it also, of course, did ultimately choose not the popular vote, but rather something that gave disproportionate power to the slaveholding states. So tell us a little bit more about those criticisms and reactions, maybe in the first years or decades after the ratification.
Sure, sure. And I'll say as a preface to this, getting very far ahead of the story, there have been more constitutional amendments introduced in Congress to seriously reform or abolish the Electoral College than on any other subject. They started in the 1790s, and Congress came very close to serious reforms of the Electoral College between 1812 and 1826. Amendments passed one branch of Congress 4 times in that period. A lot of the criticism had to do with the decisions that were left to the states. The Constitution says that electors will be chosen in such manner as determined by the state legislature. What that did was to permit state legislatures, to decide how they would do it. Originally, I think most people thought they would choose electors by district. And a lot of states did that initially, but they didn't have to. Some state legislatures chose electors by themselves. And then others gravitated towards winner take all, because if you were in a close election, and this became particularly apparent in 1800, and you knew that your candidate could win would win a majority of the votes in the state, and you made it winner take all, then you basically maximized your power. So what happened was that states began gravitating towards winner take all, but then encountering resistance, changing back and forth. They were gaming the system. And so the thrust of the early proposals for reform, early meaning up to into the 1830s, was to amend the Constitution to require states to choose electors through a district system, and to a popular election by districts. I should say that. And so it prohibits states from just having their legislatures choose, which South Carolina did, by the way, into the 1850s. And it would guarantee having elections and have electors chosen by district, which seemed to bring the voting closer to public opinion. So that was the early phase of reform. There was also, of course, there was criticism in the North of the fact that Southern states were wielding political power on behalf of 3/5 of the enslaved population. I mean, I'm going to add one more note here, and stop me when you want me to stop rambling, but one of the peculiar features of the Electoral College in general, and this had to do somewhat with slavery at the outset, but it carries on, is that states get electoral votes and thus power in presidential elections in proportion to their population, not in proportion to the number of people who show up to vote or can vote. So that there is actually no incentive in a state to increase turnout. And voter suppression of various types is not in any way sanctioned by the presidential election process. It's sanctioned in the sense of punished.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I guess I'll throw out one more question, and we can pivot to talking a little more about the archives. And this will race us to the present, just as a tease, maybe. From a sort of constitutional mechanical standpoint, what was supposed to happen on January 6th?
Right. I was actually on the air with NPR on the afternoon of January 6th, allegedly there to help guide them through the process. What was supposed to happen, and let me say, the laws affecting this, the laws governing this are murky and unclear. It's a law called the Electoral Count Act of 1887. But what was supposed to happen was that the electoral votes from each state would be announced. They had already been received in Congress. They would be announced and a question would be raised about whether there were objections to the electoral votes of each state. If there are no objections, those in effect are accepted, and then I guess recorded in some way, although our colleagues from the archives could tell us better. But if there are objections from both a member of the House and a member of the Senate, then the electoral votes of that state are not automatically accepted, and the two branches of Congress meet separately to decide what they think about the objection. So what was supposed to have, according to the traditional ways in which this has happened, in which there have not been any real tie-ups with objections, is that these electoral votes would have been recorded in Congress as they had already been certified by the states and by state officials, and then the totals would have been declared.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So that does bring us to the questions around record keeping and around really this very almost the holy grail, right, of our electoral traditions. So Katerina or Miriam, do you want to kick us off and tell us a little bit about how NARA became involved with the Electoral College process?
Sure, thank you, Max. And I will share my screen and present my slides. Are you able to see the slides?
Yep.
Great, well, thanks again. And I will today cover the role of the OFR in the Electoral College process. And please feel free to put the questions in the Q&A, as Max mentioned, and Miriam and I will answer any questions that you have directly for us at the end. So the Office of the Federal Register is part of the National Archives and Records Administration. And on behalf of the Archivist of the United States, we accept official certificates from the states and coordinate certain functions between the states and Congress. Our coordination duties are purely ministerial, administrative, they're apolitical and nonpartisan. So we cannot make substantive or legal determinations. We cannot speculate or opine on a different system or lobby for changes. And the purpose of my presentation will be to cover sort of three areas: how the Electoral College responsibilities came to reside with the Federal Register and NARA, what legal authority governs our coordination function, and the steps in the process. And what I talk about will represent NARA's coordination functions only. So the National Archives was created in 1934, and the following year, the Division of the Federal Register was established as part of the archives. NARA, or actually at the National Archives at the time, was moved into the General Services Administration in 1949, and the following year, there was a government reorganization. This, since the founding of the Republic, the Department of State had actually served not only as the arm of the president in the conduct of foreign relations, but as the office handling his ministerial duties. And in 1950, President Truman separated out those duties in his reorganization plan number 20. So he removed all activities not related to foreign affairs to other agencies in the executive branch. And in this process, new responsibilities were assigned to the GSA and delegated to the Federal Register within it. One of these being the administration of the Electoral College process. And so in 1952 was really the first election where the Federal Register Division handled those responsibilities. In 1985, NARA gained its independence from GSA, and it retained the Division of the Federal Register and also the Electoral College responsibility. So that is how we got to where we are today. And now I will talk about the sort of legal authority for the Electoral College. The US Constitution, specifically Article 2, Section 1, and the 12th, 14th, 20th, and 23rd Amendments And then also 3 USC Chapter 1, specifically the duties of the archivist are in section 6, 11, 12, and 13, and lay out the ministerial responsibilities. NARA is primarily responsible for coordinating the various stages of the electoral process by helping the states prepare and submit the certificates that establish the appointment of the electors and that validate the electoral votes of each state. And the archivist has delegated these operational duties to the director of the Federal Register. So the staff of the OFR ensures that electoral documents are transmitted to Congress, made available to the public, and preserved as part of our nation's history. We review the certificates for the required signatures, seals, and other matters of form as specified in federal law. However, it's important to note that only the Congress and the courts have the authority to rule on substantive legal issues. We post the certificates when we receive them from the states and make them physically available for public inspection for 1 year after the election. After that, they become part of NARA's permanent records. Really, when we talk about the Electoral College process at NARA, we're dealing with the states, specifically the governors and secretaries of states, and also DC and Congress, the House and Senate parliamentarians, the clerk of the House, and the secretary of the Senate. We act as a sort of intermediary between them. We also act as a trusted agent of Congress in reviewing the legal sufficiency of the certificates before the House and Senate accept them as evidence of official state action. So Congress is not supposed to open its set of certificates until the votes are counted, and they rely on OFR's review and assessment to avoid surprises. In a worst case scenario, if a state's electors or certificates were not to meet constitutional or statutory requirements, then all the state's votes could be disqualified, which, in a populous state could flip the election results or prevent all candidates from reaching a majority of votes, sending the election to the House and the Senate. So the process for us is a flow of certificates and it's a flow of information. States send, as mentioned, certificates to OFR and we post them and provide sets to Congress as requested. And because, as mentioned, we can review the certificates, we can work with the states to correct any errors before they get to the House floor. And we work with Congress to see what their preferred method of correction is. In terms of the flow of information, we serve as an intermediary answering states' questions on behalf of Congress. If the answers are clear cut, we can answer them. If they're not so clear, then we'll work with Congress to get the answers back to states. And since there is no central federal or other structure around the Electoral College, we also serve as a resource for the public. As Miriam mentioned, we have an in-depth website and we respond to public inquiries and phone calls about the Electoral College as well. So I'll briefly kind of walk us through some of the steps from election day through the really the end of the Electoral College process. And I want to note about this slide, the cycle happens every 4 years. So the dates on the bottom are really the statutory dates. And above, I included the 2024-2025 dates as an example. The first major deadline we're working towards is Election Day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in December. And before Election Day, OFR legal staff are working to update their resources for states. We also update our website. We provide states with sort of the key dates, the applicable federal law, constitutional provisions. And we're really reaching out to them to make sure that they know what their responsibilities are, since there can be a lot of turnover between elections. The archivist before Election Day will also send a letter to governors notifying the states of their responsibilities, and we send out various announcements and reminders throughout the process. So then we get to Election Day, which is the same date for every state. And on or after Election Day, states are appointing electors equal to the number of senators and representatives that the state has in Congress. DC also gets 3 electors. And then governors are submitting certificates of ascertainment as soon as practicable after the states certify election results. They send certificates of ascertainment to the Federal Register and also retain copies for the meeting of the electors. We review the certificates of ascertainment for the required elements and post them to our website. So this is a quick look at our sort of results page, and specifically I'll show you the 2020 results page. We post, as mentioned, as we receive and review the certificates of ascertainment are on the left under the state's name, and then we will post the certificates of vote linked immediately to the right under the number of electoral votes for that state. I'd like to show you now a couple of examples of what a certificate of ascertainment looks like. This is Maryland 2020 certificate of ascertainment. It lists the names of the electors chosen by the voters and the number of votes they received, and also the names of all the other candidates and the number of votes that they received. Here's another example from Kansas. As you can see, they're different. There's really no template, just the common required statutory elements. The next deadline we're working towards is the date for the determination of controversy as to the appointment of electors. States must make final determinations as to any controversies or contests as to the appointment of electors at least 6 days before the date of the meeting of electors for their electoral votes to be presumptively valid when presented to Congress. Determination by states' lawful tribunals are conclusive if they're decided under laws that were enacted by the state prior to election day. Electors meet and vote on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December after the general election. And the electors meet in their respective states. They cast their votes for president and vice president on separate ballots. States have prepared their certificates of vote, and the state's electoral votes are recorded on that certificate. The state then pairs those certificates of vote with those certificates of ascertainment that I mentioned they had retained. They're paired so that we can verify that the names and signatures of the electors match those who voted. And then those paired certificates are sent to NARA, where as part of the official records for the presidential election, and they're also sent to Congress, where the votes will be counted. They additionally go to 2 backup locations. Here's an example of a certificate of vote. This is from Utah 2020, contains the electors' actual votes for president and vice president, containing 2 distinct lists, and also a replacement elector certification. Electoral votes must arrive by the 4th Wednesday in December. That's a statutory deadline for designated federal and state officials to receive paired certificates 9 days after the meeting of the electors. If no certificate of vote is received from a state by that deadline, or if our legal staff will make a demand from the backup locations. And as the new Congress assembles, the archivist transmits the sets of certificates to Congress as needed. This generally happens when the Senate does not receive its certificates on time, for example. The transfer occurs in late December or early January when the legal staff of the Federal Register meet with the representatives of the Secretary of the Senate and the Clerk of the House. Pretty much at this point, the role of OFR is complete, and the rest of the process lies with Congress. Congress meets in joint session January 6th, the year after the election, to count votes. And then Inauguration Day is January 20th, when the new president and vice president are sworn in, and that completes the Electoral College cycle. So, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katerina. And yeah, so again, throw questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be coming back to them in a few moments. Miriam, anything to add?
No, so we'll just see what questions come in.
Okay, great. So yeah, right. Pretty remarkable that our federal, we don't have a federal election apparatus beyond what Katerina just described to us, right? That they really truly are the responsibilities of the states, including elections of the presidency and vice presidency. Okay, so Alex, if we could, I guess I'd like to throw out another couple of questions before we open it up. So one moment, of course, that many of us are familiar with is the Hayes-Tilden election in 1876. Can you, and I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but can you briefly describe for us that controversy and how it played out? Because I think, we always throw around in the media, there's always, everything's unprecedented. But I wondered if you could tell us about what some of the more messy moments may be in the Electoral College's history.
Well, 1876 was certainly a messy moment in Electoral College history. The short version of a complicated story is that Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York, the Democratic candidate, appeared to have won the popular vote, although I would make that statement with an asterisk that I will then explain. He appeared to have won the popular vote, and in the electoral vote count, I think he was one vote short of the needed majority. I mean, the Constitution requires that the winning candidate win a majority of electoral votes, not just a plurality. You have to win a majority. Tilden was one vote short. There were disputes about the electoral votes in 3 southern states where the Republicans, the candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes, but where the Republicans were convinced that very sizable voter intimidation and suppression had occurred, so that the actual vote count was not legitimate, and that it violated, and specifically that it violated the recently passed 15th Amendment, which said that you could not discriminate based on race, color, and previous condition of servitude. So the Republicans argued that the vote counts were not legitimate. There was also, in addition to the 3 states, I think if I remember this correctly, there was a dispute over one elector in Oregon who was also a postmaster. If I don't go to the bank on this story about Oregon, but and electors are not allowed to be people who hold high office or a government office, and the question was whether his being a postmaster disqualified him. Anyway, so you had this dispute. It was going to determine the election. One branch of Congress had a Democratic majority. One branch had a Republican majority. There was just a complete impasse, and they appointed a special commission of 15 people, and that commission, in what, again, it's a long story, what was effectively a partisan vote, awarded every disputed electoral vote to Hayes by an 8-7 vote within the 15-member commission. And the legitimacy of Hayes was disputed for a long time. He was referred to in Democratic newspapers as his fraudulency, but he did become president. Part of the larger political deal is that, to placate the Democrats, he appears to have agreed to remove Union troops from the South and thus bring an end to Reconstruction and to the presence of Northern and federal military power in the South. So that was a major concession to the South, which had lost a candidate. I should say, I alluded earlier to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Well, the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was, the necessity of it emerged from the disputed election of 1876, because they really, what was clear was that they didn't have they had no process, no legal process for deciding among disputed electoral votes. They were making it up as they went along, and they knew it. And so some people in Congress had known that before and had tried to get the Congress to address it, but they hadn't in the early 1870s. So after the 1876 election, Congress says, okay, we don't want to do this again, so let's pass a law that will clarify things. And it took them 11 years to write that law, the Electoral Count Act of 1887, and it clarified some things, but it certainly did not clarify other things, and it is still with us today. There is there are a number of people in Congress, at least, who would like to reform the Electoral Count Act.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, again, to recap, right? So NARA isn't just a wonderful archive, but also the agency charged with trying to keep these records intact and facilitate the whole of the Electoral College process. A rather small, we could say, federal agency for such an important process to our democracy. Okay, so Alex, to stick with that, I teach African American history. All of us who are here as educators, we split the survey in 1877, right? And it's this hugely important moment that we've just been discussing. So if we kind of want to widen our lens, and our friends here don't have to opine, but you and I can, we have the first compromise that creates the Electoral College that, as you said, does give disproportionate power to the southern slave states, or to the white voting public in those slave states. And then, of course, we go through the experience of the Civil War, which ultimately becomes about slavery, right? The nation goes through the experience of Reconstruction. There follows not just one cycle of electoral violence and irregularity and fraud, but an annual autumnal ritual, right? As Steve Hahn quotes it, right? Of this sort of disputed elections in the South, and violence, and elections being decided again through the barrel of a gun, as opposed to through normal, fair and free electoral processes. And so that culminates in the moment you just described: 3 states where they can't agree on who won the election, and ultimately this unelected commission then deciding the outcome. And then there's this backroom deal, the apparent agreement to pull the troops out. So from the perspective of 2020, of the uprisings we've seen around the persistence of structural racism, this seems like a very important moment in which the tools that were supposed to try to both mediate between competing white factions and address Reconstruction in the wake of enslavement just failed completely. So I guess I don't know if I have a question as much as I'm just thinking about how, all this time later, right? Are we kind of still in that 10-year morass of trying to figure out what to do in the wake of this failed election, right? What to do in the wake of the Reconstruction experiment being cut short, and how. Maybe there weren't more failures of the Electoral College right away, but if we zoom out to your larger work on the right to vote, what has this meant for our democratic traditions in the 20th century?
And that's a very simple question, Max, which I can address in a minute. Let me make a few comments, and then feel free to cue me if I miss some key ingredients.
Well, and we can go back and forth on it too. I don't need to just quiz you. But
sure. No, but look, one point I want to make, because it's important, and it's important to understanding the subsequent history and the 20th century history, which is that it's easy for people to understand how the Electoral College benefited whites in the slave South because they got the 3/5 clause, etc. What's much less known, and of great importance, is that after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and thanks to the violence, among other things that you noted, there were all sorts of laws that were passed that disenfranchised the African American population once again. They were free, but they were disenfranchised. But the states that they lived in got the same number of electoral votes. And in fact, the white South, you could argue, from 1876 into the late 1960s, benefited from what you could call a 5/5 clause.
Right.
They got representation for the entire Black population, but the Black population still wasn't allowed to vote. Not surprisingly, picking up a different thread here, the major source of political resistance to Electoral College reform came from Southerners during this period. It was the South that resisted it. Most people don't know this, but we almost got rid of the Electoral College in 1969, 1970. We came within a whisker of it, and it was a Southern filibuster in the Senate that killed it. But I think that I think that the broader issue about voting rights, which is something that goes beyond the Electoral College, and affects state governments, as well as the federal government, is that we have to understand that that elections in this country, until arguably after 1970, were not based on a majority vote of the people in many areas of the country, and that this had consequences.
Yeah, great, thank you. And right, thinking more about that. So you go from a 3/5 clause to a 5/5 clause. I like that framing, right? And then you do get the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and its renewal and amendment. That is, of course, an unprecedented federal intervention in terms of trying to assure voting rights for African Americans in the South. They're sending federal registrars into the South, law enforcement. And for a moment, right, we see significant change. But then we also, of course, see massive realignment in a partisan sense. And today, right, these are areas sometimes that still have very large, if not majority, African American populations, but that are voting for Republican parties led by Donald Trump, let's say, in 2020 and in 2016. And so one could argue, and people do, right, that the Electoral College, if its original purpose was providing, or the effect anyway, and for some of its framers at least, the goal, providing additional political power for white male Southern property holders, that it's still being very effective at accomplishing that goal today, in terms of those states are getting more votes in the Electoral College than they would be if we had, say, a national popular vote. Does that seem right?
Yeah, well, I think that's I think that's true, but I think this is also where winner take all comes in. Winner take all is not in the Constitution. Okay, the Constitution does not say you should use winner take all, but as I mentioned, it became a much criticized practice in the first third of the 19th century, and it's became the dominant form since then. And I think that a lot of what you see in the states of the old Confederacy and some others is you see particularly since the realignment of the parties after the 1960s, and when in effect Southern Democrats gradually left and joined the Republic, Southern white Democrats joined the Republican Party, and most African Americans began to adhere to the Democratic Party. What you see is a situation where many states in that region have large minorities. So where the population is 35% Black. But winner take all means, in effect, that the Republican Party during this period has been able to garner all of the electoral votes. There were some unsuccessful constitutional lawsuits filed in the last couple of years that dealt with this, that said, something like, I forget the exact figures, but some enormous proportion of African Americans, I think Texas was one of the states, in fact, that the state in their lifetimes had never voted for a candidate that they had supported. It did not get very far in the courts, but but then again, but we're also seeing now is that the demographics are changing. When I'm asked I'm frequently asked to predict about electoral college reform, and can things change and will things change, and I try not to be pie in the sky about it, but and it's been a pretty pessimistic period. But when you look at what's happening in the state of Georgia, right now, where Georgia is no longer predominantly white and dominantly Republican state. We know this. It can go either way. Well, if I were a high-ranking Republican official in Georgia, which is unlikely to happen, but if I were a high-ranking Republican official in Georgia, I'd start to question winner take all, because you can lose a lot with winner take all. And in your state, in Texas as well, it seems to me the same dynamics may be going on.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, right? I mean, you talk about demographic change, and it's not just in migration and people who are citizens and therefore voting, but also, right, huge numbers of people who are non-citizens, and many people in my state, in Texas and elsewhere, who are undocumented, who don't really have a path to citizenship, right? And so, if you think of that, I mean, I'm not sure I share your optimism in that sense, only because in Texas and in Georgia, we see this happening rapidly, right? What is now becoming a minority party when it comes to folks who are sort of super partisan white Republicans, right, are taking other means to make sure that they maintain control through voter suppression measures. And of course, the gerrymandering of the local, the state election districts, which then produce and control the state election machinery. And as you said, the federal government has no means for sanctioning or really protecting voting rights within the states in any meaningful way. So I think you're right in the sense that if Texas, for example, were to ever flip, we would hear many calls from Republican leaders to get rid of winner take all, right? Because it would be hard for them to chart a path for victory. But I think that it seems that the tack that they're taking instead is simply trying to restrict the franchise and maintain that control over all of those electoral votes, including votes from immigrants who they often say they wish to deport.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me add one other thing in here too, because it's relevant to where we are in the contemporary world, which is that the constitutional provision that leaves it to state legislatures to decide how their states will choose electors has now reemerged as a significant issue that we'll be facing in 2024. It surfaced in the 2020 election, and there's certainly a movement within among some folks on the political spectrum to directly empower state legislatures, which are inescapably partisan bodies, to overturn certification decisions made by nonpartisan state officials. That's, again, it's part of the informal and incomplete plumbing of in the original federal electoral system and in its modifications, but it leaves weaknesses that can be exploited.
These are the so-called unpledged electors, right?
Well, even aside from unpledged electors, I mean, if in some states there are now state laws have been passed that says that that basically builds on the constitutional notion that it's a state legislature that can decide how electors are chosen, and it gives the state legislatures the power to decide, for example, if there is a dispute, which candidate won the election and thus will get the electoral votes. I mean, the previous model had been to leave that in the hands of as nonpartisan official as you can find.
Normally a Secretary of State or something. Yeah, right. Okay, so I want to turn to a couple of the questions here that are coming in, and please keep them coming in the Q&A or the chat. And I guess I'm going to combine these, but one of the questions is how has the anti-democratic nature of the Electoral College, in terms of how it influences politics and politicians, how has that changed over time? Has this discourse evolved in particular ways? And then again, getting back to the Electoral Count Act of '87 and its long history, why did it fail so dramatically in 2021? Asked Donald Rogers. And was this historically unprecedented? So Yeah, kind of two pieces there, but
Yeah, no. And I actually I just put them up on my screen so that I could keep them in mind. I think that in response to the first question, you know, politicians are in business to win elections. And I think that, you know, that the shape of the Electoral College guides, you know, numerous decisions, decisions on effects on politicians and on politics, how it has changed over time. You know, I also have to say, having read more years of the congressional record than anyone in their lifetime ever should contemplate doing for to write my book on the Electoral College. There has been in both parties, you know, there's been a lot of pro-democratic idealism as people who really kind of went to the wall to try to reform the Electoral College. You know, just you know, eloquent pleas on both sides. But when it comes down to it, I think that the major anti-democratic feature of the Electoral College that is an influence is winner take all. And it leads all sorts of people to do calculations about, you know, how will this affect the presidential election in Pennsylvania? Because we know it's a swing state and we know it's winner take all and the stakes are high. On the second question, about the Electoral Count Act of 1887, it was, yes, indeed, it was supposed to create a system to resolve disagreements, in essence, to depoliticize that process. But, you know, they couldn't, it's, I've actually, in recent months, I've been sitting down occasionally and saying, well, how can I devise a process that would work here? If I rewrite the Electoral Count Act, it's a difficult challenge because, in effect, what the Electoral Count Act, in effect, what it does is it says that that elections as submitted to our colleagues here, that the electoral votes as submitted there and as then forwarded to Congress to be open, cannot be successfully challenged unless that challenge is approved by both branches of Congress. But it's still Congress that is doing it, and it's still partisan. And then there's a provision, and again, our colleagues may correct me, that that if there is a dispute over the legitimacy of different slates of electors, if, for example, a state governor, the Secretary of State sends in one slate of electors and a governor sends another slate of electors, that the one that will be considered winning or legitimate is the one that is signed by the governor. And you know, these are dispute resolution mechanisms, but they don't remove partisanship from it. It's still all in the hands of elected officials.
yeah, great, thanks. And okay, so it sounds like what you've been saying sort of throughout the hour is that the real question is winner take all, right? And
Well, that's one real question.
yeah, one of the big ones. What would it take to change that? And also, there's a last question on the Q&A that you can see. What about the move to designate electors based on the national popular vote rather than the state votes?
Wait, what was the first question?
How could we move away from winner take all? And then is this other national popular vote movement a good solution?
Right. Well, I think that the most, you know, in theory, we can move away from winner take all by individual states taking action. Okay, and Nebraska and Maine have already done it. And states could decide that they will use a district system or a proportional system. A proportional system, I think, would be better. If you win 38% of the vote in Texas, you get 38% of the electoral vote, and that way you don't get electoral votes enmeshed in gerrymandering, which is a big enough problem already. But states could do it, but there's a long history, which I sketch in the book at excessive length, of states trying to do it, even quite recently in our history. But the first mover in such a mechanism will suffer. In other words, a state loses some political power if its electoral votes are divided up. So the other way to do it is through a constitutional amendment. And, and I think, although my personal preference would be to actually have a national popular vote, I think that a perhaps more politically acceptable and perfectly reasonable compromise would be to have a constitutional amendment that said each state has to choose its electors on a proportional vote basis. And that would end up that would mirror pretty closely the electoral vote. On the second question, which is about, I think it's just about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact,
Right.
Which is an agreement that states that join the compact will agree to cast their electoral votes not for the winner of the state's election, but for the winner of the national popular vote. I think that the compact idea emerged out of frustration with the difficulties of getting reform of the Electoral College and the fact that you need supermajorities to reform to amend the Constitution. And I was a supporter of it. My support has seriously lessened. I think it is too complicated a mechanism. And if anything that 2020 showed us is that we need to simplify our mechanisms rather than to further complicate, because this would keep the Electoral College in place. My other criticism of the compact is that states that join it cannot leave the compact within 6 months of an election, but they can leave the compact any other time that they want. So if you pass, suppose they got enough votes to install the compact, then you need states with 270 electoral votes to do that. If you could have an election run on compact rules 1 year, and then a couple of states pull out and don't like it, and so then you'd be running back on the old Electoral College rules the next year. And then you start having people gaming the system about, do they think their candidate is going to do better under the compact or under the old rules? I think we need more stability and simplicity in our electoral processes.
Yeah, that sounds like a bunch of lawsuits waiting to happen.
Look, you could think of the whole thing as a kind of make-work program for lawyers.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question here about the third party, whether third parties have garnered electoral votes in the 20th century. I can think of two quick instances. One in 1948, when Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat or States' Right Party broke away from the National Democrats under Harry Truman, but the liberal Roosevelt wing of the party, and so they won much of the South under Strom Thurmond. Also 1968, where George Wallace goes out on his own and under the American Independent Party. Okay, we have someone else who I think who can jump in, Sydney, if you'd like, you're welcome to.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So, and you're right, 1968 is the last time that an actual third party who was running on the ballot won enough of the popular vote to actually earn or win X number of electors. There have been since then in a handful of elections, even just in the 2016 election, there were a lot of electors who were pledged or possibly not pledged to specific candidates who voted for somebody else, but they were not actually electors for a third party. A third party did not, in fact, win those candidates. They were protest votes, for lack of a better term. So even in 2016, the Libertarian Party candidate actually was on the ballot in, I think, 48 or possibly 51, including DC, of the jurisdictions of the states, and did not win enough votes in any of the states to actually win an elector. And now the name is escaping me. That's a sign of old age, I'm told. The billionaire H. Ross Perot, who he won millions of votes, but he didn't win them in any one state the first time he ran. And so even with his popularity as a third party candidate, he did not win an electoral vote. So the last time a third party candidate won an actual elector was 1968.
And it's notable that third party candidates that are regionally based or based on regional issues have some chance of getting electoral votes, whereas more ideological candidates do not. I mean, in 1948, for example, what's his name?
Strom Thurmond.
No, there was a fourth candidate.
Oh,
Henry Wallace.
Henry Wallace, of course.
Henry Wallace got almost as many popular votes as Thurmond, but he got no electoral votes.
Well, and I think that it's, I mean, yes, so clearly there's a regional base there, but it's also a regional base rooted in a particular ideology, right? Both 48 and 68, you know, these were campaigns based on white supremacy and in places where they controlled enough of the electoral machinery and also the sort of the pragmatic means of getting elected, right? The get out the vote machinery, right, in order to win in these places. And so, you know, I guess I flag that only to say that we started out with thinking about why the Electoral College exists in the form that it's in. And here we are where, you know, fast forward to, we think about third party possibilities or other sorts of shifts. And we're very much still, I think, you know, dealing with those legacies of not that the South was exceptional, but that it had this particular role in shaping the political system. And that we're still grappling with what does it mean for our democracy that we are so particular about how we exercise it, let's put it that way, through the Electoral College. So I think we're about out of time. Any parting words, Alex? Anyone else?
No, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to particularly thank our colleagues who educated me, at least, about the actual process, which is very intriguing. And I do find myself asking a question which you didn't have time to address, which was like, well, how did the process work in 1874? But you know, but I'll look that up. But thank you, everybody.
Yeah, horses and paper.
Yeah, well, wonderful. And thank you all for being here. I'll throw it back to you, Beth, if you have any closing words from OAH.
Yes, thank you everybody for a great discussion. This has been a wonderful introduction to our new Future of the Past series. Our next webinar in the series will be on the January 6th insurrection that occurred on January 6, 2021. Looking at that and contextualizing it, looking at it historically. And that will be open for registration here shortly. We will announce that on our website. And this video, the video from today's session will be available on our site as well. So once again, thank you everybody. And it's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.